In 1773, a British explorer found a manuscript in Ethiopia that the Church wanted to erase forever. That ancient text describes a divine judgment so severe that no modern theologian dares to fully explain it. It is about what the Archangel Michael did with the chains of the fallen angels in the times before the flood. For centuries, the official version maintained that those women were mere victims caught by superior beings. But the oldest texts reveal something completely different, something that most prefer never to teach. There are details that were deliberately omitted, entire passages that were left out of the conventional narrative. What you are going to discover today completely changes the way we understand that chapter of sacred history. Because the sky did not treat those women as victims, it treated them as active participants in corruption. And the one sent to execute that judgment was neither a messenger of comfort nor a compassionate spiritual advisor. It was Michael, commander of the heavenly armies and the very sword of justice from the throne of God on earth. To understand that punishment, one must first understand the crime that provoked it from its deepest roots. We must go back to the beginning of what many scholars consider the darkest chapter of humanity. Genesis chapter 6 opens with a description that has puzzled scholars for many centuries. It says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, found them beautiful, and took them as wives. The Hebrew expression B'nai Elohim also appears in the Book of Job to designate beings of a celestial nature. It does not refer to pious men or descendants of Seth, as some later interpretations have suggested. Jewish interpreters of antiquity and the fathers of the early church agree on the reading of this passage. Those sons of God were not ordinary men, but angelic beings who abandoned their assigned place in the heavens. The Book of Enoch refers to them as watchers and recounts that 200 of them descended together to Mount Hermon. They descended with a dark and forbidden purpose from the very foundation of the cosmos that God had created with His Word. They made a solemn pact among themselves at the top of that mountain, swearing that none would back down from their decision. Each of the 200 sealed with their name the commitment to cross a line that should never have been crossed. Their leader, Semiasa, was the first to commit, and after him, the others swore to follow him regardless of the cost. They knew that what they were about to do would challenge the eternal order, but none of them hesitated in front of that. They took human women as wives and fathered children with them, violating the boundaries between heaven and earth. Through those unions, elements that should never have existed in the earthly plane were introduced into the human world. The children born from those unions were the Nephilim, giant beings of extraordinary size and insatiable appetite. First, Enoch describes them devouring the animals, then the crops, and finally they turned against humans. They were beings of an unknown violence until then, creatures that did not fit into any known natural order. The earth trembled under their weight, and humanity lived in terror of the presence of those giants among them. The rivers were stained with blood, and the fields lay barren under the endless appetite of those enormous beings. The cry of suffering humanity rose to the heavens, and the archangels looked down and saw the horror. They saw how God's original plan for humanity had been distorted to the point of becoming unrecognizable. But the physical destruction was not the worst thing the Watchers brought when they descended from the heights of heaven. The truly devastating thing was the forbidden knowledge that they deliberately passed on to their wives. They were taught the secrets of witchcraft, enchantments, and the direct manipulation of the spiritual world. They revealed sealed arts in the heavens, dark forces that no human being should know under any circumstances. Azazel, in particular, taught how to make weapons of war, to work with metals for destruction and shedding blood. It also conveyed the art of cosmetics and adornment, tools of seduction that altered the social order. Other watchers taught astrology, the reading of the stars for divination and spiritual control. The weight of what they were receiving was immense, but the seduction of power was greater than any caution. Each one revealed a different piece of that forbidden knowledge, which together formed a complete system of power. That system was not just information, it was an open door to dimensions that were meant to remain sealed. And here the story takes a turn that almost no one mentions, a turn that changes everything regarding the trial that would come. Because the question raised by the ancient texts is not only what the Watchers did with those women. The real question is what they did with the forbidden knowledge they received from those beings. Our instinct drives us to focus on the Watchers, for they were the ones who broke ranks in the sky. Once that door was opened, there was no way to close it, and those who crossed it were marked forever. It was the celestial beings who descended when they should have remained above, and we see them as the guilty ones. Women, in our minds, become passive figures, trapped in something that was never their direct fault. However, the text does not treat them that way, and the judgment that follows does not consider them victims of deception either. First, Enoch clearly describes that these women were taught in a specific, profound, and intentional manner. They gained knowledge of enchantments, witchcraft, and arts that granted them an unknown power among humans. The text doesn't depict them horrified by what they learned, nor does it show any resistance or rejection from them. What it describes is how those forbidden practices spread from them to the rest of all humanity. It was not a passive transfer of information. It was an active expansion that they themselves carried out every day. They taught other women what they had learned, and those women in turn passed it on to others in a chain. Forbidden knowledge was not contained within a small group. It spread like a plague throughout civilization. Generation after generation, these practices became integrated into everyday life until they seemed completely normal. There is a principle that runs throughout the entire scripture, from the first chapter of Genesis to the Revelation. That principle establishes that knowledge creates responsibility, and that whoever receives something is accountable for its use. These women did not walk blindly in the dark. They were educated by beings that existed before creation. They received ancient, powerful, and deeply forbidden instruction, given by entities of a supernatural nature. They were not receiving common knowledge or everyday wisdom. They were accessing secrets of the celestial order. The record clearly shows they neither rejected nor distanced themselves from those arts. They did not resist. They did not ask for divine help. They did not cry out to God to be freed from what they had in their hands. They practiced it. They spread it. And through its practice, corruption began to flow like an unstoppable poison. That spiritual poison penetrated the very veins of human civilization until it transformed it into something unrecognizable. The cities that once worshipped the Creator were now filled with altars dedicated to dark and rebellious forces. Families that once lived under natural law were now operating under principles that contradicted all divine norms. The order that God had established for humanity was replaced by a spiritual chaos that consumed everything. Marriages became corrupted, communities fragmented, and the very fabric of society began to break apart. By the time heaven cast its full gaze upon the earth in the days leading up to the flood, the scene was chaotic. The Nephilim, descendants of the Watchers and those women, had become beings of pure violence. They consumed everything in their path without leaving anything. First animals, then crops, and finally, they attacked people. But it was not only physical violence that infested the land. Spiritual contamination was advancing at the same pace. The forbidden knowledge given to the wives of the Watchers had already spread to the entire population of the earth. Witchcraft ceased to be something isolated. Enchantments were practiced openly and without fear in every village. People used those arts to manipulate themselves, to gain control over others, and to connect with forbidden forces. Genesis 6 expresses it with a clarity that leaves no room for doubt. The earth was corrupted and full of evil. All flesh had corrupted its way, not just the Watchers, not just the Nephilim, but humanity as a whole. Everything that God had created had deviated from its original purpose, and it was not solely the fault of celestial beings. It happened because the knowledge they brought with them found willing hands in the land to receive and spread it. The sky observed everything in silence, but that silence was not indifference. It was the calm that precedes all judgment. God's response was swift, precise, and total. Every aspect of the corruption would receive specific treatment. The archangels were summoned and received specific missions. Each would face a part of the created problem. Raphael was sent to bind Azazel, one of the Watchers' leaders, hand and foot, and cast him into the darkness. Gabriel was ordered to confront the Nephilim, causing their violence to destroy each other. Uriel was sent to warn Noah about the flood that would cleanse the earth of all that widespread corruption. Each mission was specific, and each intervention was calculated. God did not destroy without criteria, compassion, or direction. He treated each aspect of corruption with the precision of a surgeon who knows where to cut and why he does it. But after dealing with the Watchers and the Nephilim they had fathered, one crucial question remained unanswered. A weighty question that the ancient text does not evade, disguise, or hide from those who read it with attentive eyes. The question was direct and terrible at the same time. What would happen to the women who spread the forbidden knowledge? What would happen to those who had received the secrets, practiced them, and spread them among everyone? The silence of the sky in response to that question was deafening, as if all of creation were holding its breath. Those wives, woven so deeply into the fabric of corruption, could not simply be set aside. Her participation in what happened had not been passive or accidental, and the judgment of heaven would not treat them as such. There is a moment in the text where you can feel the weight of that question hanging in the air before the sentence. The Watchers were already chained in eternal darkness. The Nephilim were annihilating each other in their own war. The flood was preparing to purify the earth, and then the attention of the heavens turned directly towards them. With that attention came the most imposing and feared figure of the entire angelic hierarchy described in the scriptures. Of all the archangels, Michael is distinguished by a characteristic that makes him unique and unmistakable in the texts. He is not described as a teacher, nor as a healer, nor as a messenger. He is primarily described as a warrior of authority. He is the commander who stands with the people of God in times of war and carries out every decree of the Most High. Daniel calls him the great prince who guards over the people of God in times of greatest danger and crisis. The Apocalypse shows him leading the armies of heaven in the final battle against the forces of darkness. The letter of Jude presents him in direct confrontation with the devil himself, not backing down a single step before him. Their mere presence on a battlefield is enough to change the course of any eternal confrontation. In all of Scripture, there is no other angelic figure that combines such military authority with such absolute obedience. Miguel never negotiates. He doesn't hesitate for a single moment. When God issues a decree, Miguel executes it without hesitation. When Miguel heads towards the shackles of the fallen angels, there is no possible confusion about what that means. It is not a visit of mercy, nor a second chance. It is the judgment of heaven brought to its fulfillment. The atmosphere of the story changes completely when Miguel appears on stage. Everything that was moving seems to freeze. The chaos of the Nephilim, the corruption and darkness of that era, are completely silenced by their mere presence. It does not arrive with anger or uncontrolled emotion. It arrives with a clear purpose and the weight of heaven behind every step. Every movement of theirs communicates one thing only, that what is about to happen is non-negotiable and irreversible. It comes to carry out something that the texts record as one of the most severe spiritual judgments on human beings. Beings that had voluntarily crossed into forbidden territory and would now face all the consequences. There was no turning back, no possible appeal. The decree was already signed in the very records of heaven. The women must have felt that something different was approaching, something unlike anything they had ever known. First, Enoch, chapter 19, describes the outcome in terms that are difficult to understand at a first reading. The wives of the Watchers became Sirens, a term that in the ancient world meant something terrible. They were not creatures from Greek legends or decorative figures from mythology. The concept pointed to something very real. They were wandering spirits, entities bound to desolate places, linked to the dangerous edges of the known world, linked to the deep waters, to the desert, to the territories that existed outside of human order and protection. Women who had been at the center of human life, who were wives, mothers, and members of their communities. They were separated from all of it absolutely and irreversibly. Their connection to humanity was severed forever. Their place in the ordered world was completely taken from them. But they were not thrown into a prison like the Watchers. They received a different kind of exile, a restless wandering between the realms of the living and the spiritual. An existence on the very edges of the world, belonging neither to the realm of the living nor to that of the spirits either. Rejected by both sides of reality, condemned to wander endlessly through a territory where nothing would welcome them. Imagine for a moment what it means to be stripped of all belongings, all connections, and all human identity. There is no death, there is no rest, there is no community to welcome you, only an eternal wandering between worlds that reject you. Here lies the theological weight of that judgment that you need to understand deeply before moving forward. They had crossed sacred boundaries, and that was exactly the heart of their transgression from the very first moment. They participated in breaking the boundaries that God had set to protect the sacred order of all his creation. The Watchers descended from where they were meant to be, and the women rose towards what they were forbidden to touch. Together, they broke the sacred walls that God had placed between the celestial and the earthly, between the divine and the human. And the judgment that Miguel executed contained a terrible symmetry, an exact correspondence with the crime committed. They had refused to stay within their limits, so the sky decided to remove all limits from them completely. What remains when God removes all your limits is not the freedom we imagine, but something infinitely worse. It is an endless wandering, without a home and without rest, that is exactly what the wives of the fallen received. Now, there is a legitimate question that deserves to be answered honestly. because it is already forming in your mind. Those women were taken by beings infinitely superior to them. Perhaps heaven unjustly blames them. It is a valid question that deserves a direct and straightforward answer, based on what the scriptures themselves say. From beginning to end, Scripture establishes a firm principle regarding knowledge and responsibility. When Eve was deceived in Eden, the deception did not eliminate the consequences of her action, nor the weight of her decision. God addressed what had happened, and the actions carried real weight, even though the deception had been undeniable. Being deceived does not eliminate responsibility, much less when continued participation follows the initial deception. That is precisely the key word that defines this entire story from its beginning to its terrible known ending. The word is continued participation, and it marks the difference between who was a victim and who became an accomplice. The women in the days of the Watchers were not deceived even once, to then immediately regret it. The text describes a sustained and prolonged practice of the forbidden arts that were taught to them in detail. Witchcraft was not a one-time event. The enchantments did not cease after the first day or the first practice. Those arts took deep root, multiplied and expanded, indicating voluntary and conscious participation. Jewish interpreters of antiquity understood this, and the writers of the Talmudic period also confirmed it. The rabbis who studied the relationship between the Book of Enoch and Genesis understood that this judgment was not arbitrary. It was the precise and just response of a God who takes every corruption introduced into his creation with absolute seriousness. Miguel did not act out of anger or revenge. He acted from the authority delegated by the heavenly throne itself. The judgment he executed came from a God who does not ignore what has been broken, nor allows transgression to go unpunished. But this story is not simply a tale of the distant past, and it is here where its relevance reaches us all. Jesus himself in the Gospel of Matthew pointed to the days of Noah as a prophetic image of the last times of the world. He said that, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man, and he described a blind humanity. They ate, drank, and married without suspecting anything until the day Noah entered the ark and the flood came upon them all. They had no idea what was coming until the waters swept away everything on the surface of the world. The days of Noah were not only days of violence, they were days when sacred boundaries were crossed without cease. Limits between the divine and the human, between the physical and the spiritual, between God's design and rebellion against it. We now live in a world where those same boundaries are being challenged at levels that seemed like science fiction. The line between the human and something different blurs in ways that would have been unthinkable just 20 years ago. The spiritual world is explored by people without any protective framework, without guidance, and without understanding the risks. Ancient practices that belong to the category of the forbidden are presented today as wellness and empowerment. They are sold as progress and evolution, but in essence, they are the same arts that corrupted the world before the flood. And no one warns those who practice them that they are crossing exactly the same lines that those women crossed. The lesson of the wives of the fallen angels is not a lesson of condemnation. It is a warning that crosses the ages. Participating in the forbidden does not protect you from the consequences, no matter how many people around you practice it. Those women believed they were gaining something valuable. They thought that the knowledge they received was true power. But in reality, they wove their own existence within a judgment that would ultimately take away absolutely everything from them. The sky remains the same as it was in those days. God has not changed, and his principles have not changed either. What governed that era also governs ours, and Miguel remains the same executor of the order of heaven. So there remains a question that deserves to be considered seriously long after these words have stopped resonating. If heaven looked at those women and saw not victims but participants, what does it see when it turns its gaze towards us? What are we accepting that we should be rejecting? What knowledge are we receiving that we should be returning intact? What limits are we crossing because the world says it is normal, that it is acceptable, that this is how things are in this era? The wives of the fallen did not wake up one day determined to destroy the world. It was not a grand and conscious decision. They were small decisions, one after another, that transformed them into something they were never meant to be. With each step, they moved further away from who they were, until there was no path back to the identity that God had given them. Don't let that be your story. Don't allow the comfort of the present to blind you to what is coming tomorrow. That is the most powerful warning that this ancient story holds for us, and it would be very unwise to ignore it. If these words have sparked new questions in your mind, subscribe to continue exploring the hidden mysteries.